The sun dipped low over the hills of Carmel, casting a golden glow across the fields and vineyards. Abigail stood at the entrance of her home, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Her life, though blessed with wealth and comfort, often felt like a balancing act. Her husband, Nabal, was a rich man, but his temper and arrogance were as vast as his fortune. Abigail had long since accepted her role as the steady hand in the household, the one who soothed frayed tempers and smoothed over Nabal's offenses. But lately, it seemed as though the cracks in her marriage were widening, threatening to split everything apart. That morning, she had overheard the servants whispering about Nabal's latest insult. It was no secret that her husband's sharp tongue and foolish pride had earned him more enemies than friends. Abigail sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She had spent years patching up the damage he left in his wake, but even she couldn't predict what trouble might come next. Inside the house, the sounds of Nabal's feast echoed through the halls. Laughter and the clinking of goblets filled the air, but Abigail knew the celebration was little more than a mask for Nabal's selfishness. He was feasting on the fruits of their labor, oblivious to the needs of those who worked tirelessly in the fields. "Nabal," she said, stepping into the room where he lounged, a goblet of wine in hand. "I've heard that David's men have been protecting our shepherds and flocks in the wilderness. They've asked for our kindness in return." Nabal waved her off, his face flushed with drink. "David? That nobody? Who does he think he is? I owe him nothing." Abigail's heart sank. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that Nabal would see reason, but his pride was as immovable as ever. She knew of David's reputation, not just as a warrior, but as a man of God. Insulting him would surely bring consequences, and she feared what might follow. Later that evening, as Abigail walked through the courtyard, one of the servants approached her, his face pale with worry. "Madam," he said, his voice trembling, "I must tell you something. David and his men are furious. When your husband insulted them, it was the final straw. They're coming, and they're bringing their swords." Abigail's blood ran cold. David wasn't just any man. He was a skilled warrior, a leader with hundreds of loyal followers. If he was angry enough to bring an army, the consequences would be devastating. "Gather the servants," she said quickly, her mind racing. "We must act before it's too late." Abigail didn't waste time. She instructed the servants to load donkeys with supplies, bread, wine, roasted grain, and cakes of figs. It was a gesture of peace, a desperate attempt to turn away the wrath of a man who had every reason to seek revenge. As she oversaw the preparations, her mind replayed the stories she had heard about David. He was the one who had slain Goliath, the shepherd-turned-hero who had been anointed by God. Abigail knew she was about to face a man with the power to destroy everything she held dear, but she also knew she couldn't let fear stop her. Before dawn, Abigail mounted her own donkey, leading the procession of supplies into the wilderness. The air was cool, but her heart burned with determination. She didn't know how David would respond, but she prayed that her actions would be enough to soften his anger. As the path wound through the hills, Abigail's thoughts turned to her own life. She had married Nabal because it was expected, not because she had loved him. Over the years, she had learned to endure his insults and selfishness, but this time was different. This time, his folly could cost lives, hers included. Abigail tightened her grip on the reins, her resolve hardening. She had spent her life cleaning up Nabal's messes, but this time, the stakes were higher than ever. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Abigail caught sight of David and his men. They were descending a hill, their swords glinting in the morning sun. The sight of them, strong, determined, and ready for battle, sent a shiver down her spine. Taking a deep breath, Abigail dismounted her donkey and walked forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She bowed low before David, her voice steady but pleading. "My lord," she began, "let the blame fall on me alone. Please hear what your servant has to say." David stopped, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. The tension in the air was palpable, but Abigail pressed on, her words flowing like a river. "I know my husband is a foolish man," she said, "but please do not repay his folly with bloodshed. The Lord has kept you from unnecessary violence, and he has great plans for you. Let this moment be a testament to your restraint, not your wrath." David's expression softened, his grip on his sword relaxing. Abigail could see the weight of her words sinking in, and for the first time since she had heard of Nabal's insult, she felt a flicker of hope. The air was thick with tension as Abigail knelt before David, the leader of an army that could crush her household with a single command. Her heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. She had faced many challenges in her life, but none as urgent and dangerous as this. David stood before her, his brow furrowed, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His men surrounded him, their faces hard, their weapons ready. Abigail had interrupted their march toward destruction, and now she had only moments to convince David to show mercy. "My lord," she said again, her voice ringing with sincerity, "please do not let anger drive you to bloodshed. You are a man chosen by God, and he has kept you from making this mistake today." David's gaze softened slightly, though his jaw remained tight. "Your husband has insulted me and my men," he said, his voice low but full of restrained fury. "We protected his flocks in the wilderness, kept his shepherds safe, and asked for nothing in return. And how did he repay us? With contempt." Abigail nodded, rising slowly to her feet. "You are right to be angry," she said. "My husband's actions were foolish and thoughtless. But I ask you to see past his folly and spare the innocent lives in our household. Let this moment reflect your strength, not in vengeance, but in restraint." As she spoke, Abigail gestured to the servants who had followed her. They stepped forward, laying out the supplies she had brought: baskets of bread, skins of wine, roasted grain, and sweet cakes of figs. "These gifts are for you and your men," she said. "They are a token of gratitude for your kindness to our shepherds." David glanced at the provisions, then back at Abigail. His anger seemed to waver, replaced by a look of curiosity and admiration. "Who are you," he asked, "that you would risk so much to save your household?" "I am Abigail," she replied, meeting his gaze. "I am the wife of Nabal, and though his actions have brought us to this moment, I will do everything in my power to bring peace." The silence that followed was deafening. David's men watched their leader, waiting for his decision. Abigail's heart raced as she stood before him, willing herself not to falter. Finally, David spoke. "You have shown great wisdom today," he said, his voice steady. "And because of your courage, I will turn back. You have spared your household and kept me from shedding innocent blood." Relief flooded Abigail's chest, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she bowed low before David. "Thank you, my lord," she said. "May the Lord bless you for your mercy." David turned to his men, signaling for them to stand down. The tension in the air dissipated as the soldiers began to retreat, their weapons lowered. As Abigail watched them disappear over the hill, she felt the weight of her mission shift. She had convinced David to show mercy, but now she had to face the consequences of Nabal's folly. The journey back to her home was quiet. the servants walking beside her in solemn silence. Abigail's thoughts raced. She had saved her household from destruction, but what would Nabal say when he learned of her actions? Would he be grateful, or would his pride blind him to the danger she had averted? When she arrived, the house was alive with the sounds of a feast. Laughter and music echoed through the halls, and the smell of roasted meat filled the air. Abigail stepped inside, her jaw tightening as she saw Nabal at the center of it all, his face flushed with drink. "Nabal?" she said, her voice firm as she approached him. He turned to her, his eyes glassy. "Abigail, you're just in time to join the celebration," he slurred, raising a goblet. "This is no time for celebration," Abigail said, her tone sharp. "Do you even realize what you've done? David and his men were ready to destroy us because of your insult." Nabal laughed, waving her off. "David? That shepherd boy? He's no threat to me." Abigail's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You fool!" she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "Do you think your wealth will protect you from your arrogance? If I hadn't acted, we would all be dead by now." But Nabal wasn't listening. He returned to his feast, his laughter ringing in Abigail's ears as she stormed out of the room. That night, as the house fell silent and the guests departed, Abigail sat alone by the fire, her mind a whirlwind of anger and despair. She had done everything she could to save her household, but Nabal's pride remained unshaken. She prayed for guidance, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her husband's actions would eventually catch up with him. "Lord," she whispered, "give me the strength to endure and the wisdom to know what to do next." As the fire crackled and the shadows danced on the walls, Abigail felt a strange sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she had done what was right. The morning after the feast, the house was eerily quiet. The revelry had faded into a dull memory, and the servants moved about cautiously, their steps light as though afraid to disturb the stillness. Abigail awoke with a heavy heart. She had spent much of the night by the fire, praying for wisdom and the strength to endure Nabal's arrogance. As she dressed, she steeled herself for another confrontation with her husband. She had done all she could to save their household from David's wrath, but Nabal's blind pride was like a stone wall, immovable and unyielding. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep patching the cracks. When Abigail entered the main hall, she found Nabal slumped in a chair, his face pale and drawn. The man who had been full of wine and bluster the night before now looked weak and frail, his energy drained. "Nabal," she said cautiously, approaching him. He looked up, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he saw her. "What do you want?" he muttered, his voice hoarse. "I need to tell you something," Abigail said, sitting across from him. "Something you need to hear." Nabal waved a hand dismissively, but Abigail pressed on. "Yesterday, I went to meet David," she said, her tone firm but calm. Nabal's eyes widened, his expression shifting from indifference to anger. "You did what?" "I went to stop him," Abigail continued, her voice unwavering. "He was coming here with his men, ready to destroy everything because of your insult. I took supplies to him, and I begged him to show mercy." Nabal's face turned red with fury. "You had no right!" he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "You went behind my back, made me look like a fool." "You made yourself look like a fool," Abigail shot back, her patience finally snapping. "Do you think your wealth and your pride make you untouchable? David would have killed us all if I hadn't intervened. I saved your life, Nabal, whether you want to admit it or not." For a moment, Nabal sat in stunned silence, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find a retort. But before he could speak, a strange look came over him, his face pale, his hands trembling. He clutched his chest, gasping for breath. "Nabal," Abigail said, alarmed, rising from her chair. He didn't answer. His body slumped forward, and Abigail rushed to his side, calling for the servants. The days that followed were a blur. Nabal was bedridden, his strength fading rapidly. The once proud man who had barked orders and insulted kings now lay silent and weak, his arrogance replaced by a hollow emptiness. Abigail stayed by his side, though her emotions were a whirlwind of pity, anger, and sorrow. She had prayed for guidance, for God to intervene in their situation, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Abigail sat by Nabal's bedside, her hands folded in her lap. She had done all she could to care for him, but it was clear that his time was running out. "Nabal," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence, "do you see now? Do you understand what your pride has cost you?" He didn't answer, his gaze distant and unfocused. Abigail felt tears prick her eyes. "I tried to save you," she whispered. "Not just from David, but from yourself, but you wouldn't listen." As the room grew darker, Abigail bowed her head, her heart heavy with grief, not just for Nabal's condition, but for the life he had wasted. That night Nabal passed away, and with him the weight of his pride and folly. Abigail mourned him, not as a loving wife, but as a woman who had done everything she could to save a man who couldn't save himself. Word of Nabal's death spread quickly through the village, and soon it reached David. When he heard of what had happened, he sent messengers to Abigail, not to gloat or celebrate, but to offer her a chance at a new beginning. The messengers arrived at Abigail's home one afternoon, their presence surprising her. "David has heard of your wisdom and courage," one of them said. "He wishes to take you as his wife." Abigail was stunned. She had never imagined such an outcome. But as she thought about David, the man who had shown mercy because of her plea, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She gathered her things and prepared to leave, her heart filled with both sorrow and hope. As she rode away from the home she had shared with Nabal, Abigail looked back one last time. The hills were bathed in golden light, the fields stretching out toward the horizon. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a chance to rebuild her life on a foundation of wisdom, courage, and grace. The road to David's camp was long, winding through hills and valleys that seemed to stretch endlessly. Abigail rode in silence, her thoughts a storm of emotions. She had spent years living under the shadow of Nabal's pride and folly, constantly cleaning up the messes he left behind. But now, as she journeyed toward a new chapter of her life, she felt both a sense of freedom and a heavy uncertainty. The messengers leading her to David's camp were polite, but quiet, leaving her plenty of time to reflect. She thought of Nabal's final days, his silence as deafening as his arrogance had been in life. His passing had brought an end to a life of excess and self-importance, but it also left Abigail with questions she couldn't answer. What would her life be like now? Would she find peace among David and his men, or was she trading one set of challenges for another? By the time they reached David's camp, the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the tents and the bustling activity of his followers. Abigail dismounted her donkey, smoothing her dress as she surveyed the scene. The camp was alive with the sounds of men laughing, talking, and preparing for the evening meal. David emerged from one of the larger tents, his expression calm but curious. As he approached, Abigail felt a nervous flutter in her chest. She had spoken boldly to this man before, but now, under different circumstances, she felt the weight of the moment. "Abigail," David said, his voice steady and warm, "you are most welcome here. Your wisdom and courage have reached my ears more than once." She bowed low, her voice firm but respectful. "My lord, I come as your servant, ready to honor your request. May the Lord guide this new path." David nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You have shown great strength, Abigail. I am honored to have you join us." Life in the camp was a stark contrast to the structured luxury of Abigail's home with Nabal. The men were rugged, their lives dictated by the uncertainties of the wilderness. Yet there was a sense of purpose here, a unity that Abigail had never experienced before. David was a man unlike any she had known. He was kind and humble, but carried himself with a quiet authority that commanded respect. Abigail found herself drawn to his leadership, his ability to inspire loyalty among his men despite the hardships they faced. One evening, as Abigail sat by the fire, she listened to David speak with his men. He shared stories of battles won and lessons learned, his words laced with a deep faith in God's plan. "Even in the wilderness," David said, "the Lord is with us. He provides strength when we are weak and wisdom when we are lost. We must trust in Him, even when the path ahead is unclear." Abigail watched him, her heart stirring. For so long, she had been the one to offer wisdom and guidance, to hold her household together despite Nabal's foolishness. Now, for the first time, she felt like she could rest, like someone else was carrying the weight. But life with David was not without its challenges. The wilderness was harsh, and the constant threat of pursuit by King Saul loomed over the camp. Abigail quickly adapted, lending her skills to help wherever she could, organizing supplies, comforting the weary, and offering counsel when needed. Her presence didn't go unnoticed. David often sought her advice, valuing her insight and perspective. The men respected her, recognizing the strength it had taken to leave behind her old life and embrace a new one. Yet not everyone welcomed her so easily. Some of David's followers whispered about her, questioning her place among them. "Why did David bring her here?" one man muttered. "She was married to a fool. What wisdom could she possibly offer?" Abigail heard the whispers, but refused to let them discourage her. She had faced far worse under Nabal's roof and knew her worth wasn't determined by the opinions of others. One night, as the camp settled into quiet, Abigail found herself sitting with David by the fire. The stars above were bright, their light spilling across the hills. "Do you ever doubt, my lord?" she asked, her voice soft. David looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Doubt?" he repeated. "Yes, often. But I've learned that doubt is part of faith. It reminds us of our need for God's guidance. Without it, we would rely too much on ourselves." Abigail nodded, his words resonating deeply. She had spent so many years doubting herself, questioning whether she could ever rise above Nabal's shadow. But here, in this camp, surrounded by people who trusted in something greater, she felt a glimmer of hope. The days turned into weeks, and Abigail's presence in the camp became a source of strength for many. She found herself stepping into a new role, not as a woman overshadowed by her husband's mistakes, but as a pillar of wisdom and grace. Still, the past wasn't so easily forgotten. One evening, a messenger arrived with news from Carmel. The villagers had begun to rebuild after Nabal's death, but his reputation lingered like a stain. Abigail listened quietly, her heart heavy with the reminder of what she had left behind. "You cannot carry his legacy, Abigail," David said later that night, his voice firm but kind. "You are not defined by his choices. You have the chance to build something new." Abigail met his gaze, a flicker of determination igniting within her. "And I will," she said, her voice steady. "With God's help, I will." As the camp prepared for another journey, Abigail stood at the edge of the hills, the wind tugging at her hair. She thought of the path that had brought her here, the pain, the uncertainty, the moments of courage she hadn't known she was capable of. Her story was far from over, but for the first time in years, she felt like it was hers to write. Life in David's camp was never still. Every day brought new challenges, supplies to gather, men to encourage, and plans to evade King Saul's relentless pursuit. Abigail had settled into her role, earning the respect of many with her wisdom and resourcefulness. But not everyone welcomed her presence. There were whispers, fueled by jealousy and doubt. Some questioned why David valued her counsel so highly. Others resented the influence she seemed to wield in the camp. Abigail tried to ignore the murmurs, but they clung to her like shadows. One evening, as the camp prepared for a move deeper into the wilderness, a young soldier approached her. His face was lined with worry, and he hesitated before speaking. "Lady Abigail," he began, "there's been trouble at one of the outposts. A group of Saul's men attacked, and they took some of our supplies. David wants to send a party to recover them." Abigail's heart sank. Supplies were precious, and losing them meant hunger and hardship for everyone in the camp. But the idea of confronting Saul's men was risky, even for David's seasoned warriors. "What does David intend to do?" she asked. "He's assembling a group now," the soldier replied. "But some of the men are nervous. They say it's too dangerous." That night, Abigail sought out David. He was sitting by the fire, his expression grim as he spoke with his commanders. She waited until the others had left before stepping forward. "My lord," she said, her voice steady, "I hear there's been trouble at the outpost." David nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "Saul's men are growing bolder. If we don't act, they'll only take more." "True," Abigail said, "but rushing into a fight could cost us more than supplies. Perhaps there's another way." David raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you suggest?" "Send a small group to track them, but not to attack," she said. "Instead, let them gather information. Where Saul's men are camped, how many there are. Then we can decide how best to act." David considered her words, his expression thoughtful. "It's a risk," he said, "but a calculated one. I'll send scouts at first light." The next morning, the camp buzzed with tension as the scouts departed. Abigail busied herself with preparations, helping to organize what little food they had left. The men's anxiety was palpable, but she spoke words of encouragement where she could, her calm demeanor steadying those around her. By evening, the scouts returned with news. Saul's men were camped near a narrow ravine, their guard down after their raid. It was the perfect opportunity for David's men to recover the stolen supplies without engaging in a full-scale battle. David wasted no time. He called for a group of volunteers and began outlining the plan. Abigail stood nearby, watching as the men nodded in agreement. But one voice rose above the others, sharp and accusatory. "Why do we even listen to her?" a grizzled soldier said, pointing toward Abigail. "She's not one of us. She doesn't know what it's like out there." The camp fell silent, all eyes turning to Abigail. Her cheeks flushed, but she stood her ground. "I may not wield a sword," she said, her voice firm, "but I know the cost of foolish decisions. I've seen what happens when pride takes the place of wisdom. I'm here because I believe in David's leadership and in the Lord's guidance. If you can't see that, then perhaps it's your pride that blinds you." The soldier opened his mouth to reply, but David raised a hand, silencing him. Abigail's counsel has saved this camp more than once, David said, his tone commanding. Her wisdom is a gift, and we are stronger for it. If you cannot respect that, then you have no place among us. The plan unfolded flawlessly. David's men retrieved the stolen supplies under the cover of darkness, avoiding bloodshed and returning victorious. The camp erupted in cheers when they arrived, the tension of the past days lifting like a heavy cloud. Abigail stood at the edge of the crowd, a small smile on her lips as she watched the men celebrate. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing she had played a part in their success. That night, as the camp settled into peace, David approached her. "You have a way of seeing what others can't," he said, his voice warm. "I only do what I can," Abigail replied. David smiled. "What you do is more than enough. You've become a cornerstone of this camp, Abigail. Don't ever doubt your place here." As Abigail lay in her tent that night, she thought about David's words. For so long, she had been defined by her role as Nabal's wife, trapped in the shadow of his arrogance. But here, among these rugged men and in the wilderness, she had found a new purpose, a chance to use her wisdom for something greater. But deep down, she knew the journey wasn't over. The wilderness held its own challenges, and Saul's pursuit loomed ever closer. Abigail's resolve would be tested again, but for the first time, she felt ready. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that felt like the calm before a storm. Abigail lay awake in her tent, staring at the flickering shadows cast by the fire outside. She had grown accustomed to the constant hum of activity in the camp, but tonight even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the silence. A messenger burst into the camp, his face pale with urgency. "David!" he called out, his voice shaking. "Saul's army is moving! They found us!" The camp erupted into chaos. Men scrambled to gather their weapons and supplies, their faces tense with fear and determination. David emerged from his tent, his expression calm but focused as he began issuing orders. Abigail stood at the edge of the commotion, her heart pounding. The danger was real, and the stakes had never been higher. She watched as David's men rallied, their loyalty to him unwavering despite the odds. David approached Abigail, his tone calm but resolute. "Saul's forces are larger than ours," he said. "We need to move quickly and find a defensible position." Abigail nodded. "What can I do to help?" "Stay with the supply caravan," David said. "Your wisdom will be needed if things go wrong." Abigail hesitated. She wanted to be more than just a caretaker of supplies, but she knew David's orders were practical. "I'll do whatever is needed," she said, her voice steady. As the camp began to move, the tension was palpable. The men marched in silence, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Saul's forces. Abigail rode with the supply caravan, her heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Hours passed, the journey through the wilderness grueling and relentless. Finally, they reached a narrow valley flanked by steep cliffs. David called for a halt, signaling that this would be their place of defense. The camp worked quickly to fortify their position, using the natural terrain to their advantage. Abigail watched as David moved among his men, offering encouragement and direction. His presence was a steadying force, even as the threat of Saul's army loomed closer. But Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As night fell, she stood at the edge of the camp, staring into the darkness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant howl of the wind. "Abigail!" She turned to see David approaching, his face thoughtful. "You've been quiet," he said. "I'm worried," she admitted. Something doesn't feel right. David nodded, his gaze distant. I feel it too. But we must trust in the Lord. He has guided us this far, and he will not abandon us now. The attack came just before dawn. Saul's forces descended on the camp with terrifying speed, their war cries echoing through the valley. David's men sprang into action, their swords clashing with the enemy's in a chaotic frenzy. Abigail stayed with the supply caravan, her heart racing as she listened to the sounds of battle. She prayed fervently, her hands trembling as she helped the wounded who were brought back from the front lines. In the midst of the chaos, a group of Saul's soldiers broke through the defenses and headed straight for the supply caravan. Abigail's breath caught in her throat as they approached, their weapons gleaming in the early light. But instead of fleeing, she stood her ground. Grabbing a staff from one of the wagons, she positioned herself between the soldiers and the supplies. "This is the Lord's camp," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You will not take what belongs to his people." The soldiers hesitated, surprised by her defiance. In that moment, David's men arrived, driving them back and securing the caravan. As the sun rose, the battle began to turn in David's favor. Saul's forces, unable to navigate the narrow terrain, were forced to retreat. The camp erupted in cheers as victory became clear, but Abigail felt only relief that the worst was over. David approached her, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, but alight with gratitude. "You stood your ground," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "I couldn't let them take what God has provided," she replied simply. David smiled. "You are braver than many men I know." As the camp settled back into peace, Abigail sat by the fire, her heart full of gratitude. She had faced her fears and found strength she didn't know she possessed. David sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "The Lord's hand was on us today," he said. Abigail nodded. "He has guided us through so much. I believe he has greater plans for you, David, for all of us." David looked at her, his gaze steady. "And you are part of those plans, Abigail. Your wisdom and courage have been a light in the darkness. I thank God for bringing you to us." As the stars filled the sky, Abigail felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her past with Nabal felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the hope and purpose she had found in her new life. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. And as the fire crackled beside her, Abigail whispered a prayer of gratitude, her heart full of faith in the God who had brought her this far.